Right now, as you watch this, a small group of people is shaping what you believe, what you buy, and how you vote, and you have no idea it's happening. Researchers at the University of Pennsylvania discovered something that should terrify you. Once just 25% of a population commits to a belief, it can reshape an entire civilization. That's it, not 50%, not 70, just 1 in 4, and here's what makes this truly disturbing. It doesn't matter if the belief is true. The mechanism works regardless. History is not written by majorities. It never has been. It's written by the most organized, the most vocal, the most relentless minority in the room. And the majority, they do what majorities have always done. They stay silent. They assume someone else will speak up. They convince themselves that neutrality is safety. But here's the psychological trap nobody talks about. Your silence is not neutrality. Your silence is a vote for whoever is speaking loudest. Today, we're going to dissect exactly how small groups hijack the beliefs of millions, why your brain is wired to let it happen, and what you can do before it's too late. The 25% threshold. In 2018, researchers at the University of Pennsylvania ran an experiment that changed how we understand social change. They created online communities where people had already agreed on a social norm. Then they introduced a committed minority who consistently pushed for a different norm. When that minority reached just 10% of the group, nothing happened. At 15%, still nothing. But something remarkable occurred at 25%. When a committed minority reaches approximately 25%, they can tip the entire population to adopt their position. The majority didn't just tolerate the new belief, they adopted it, they internalized it, they began defending it as if it had always been their own. Think about that for a moment. 3/4 of a group can hold a position, and a determined quarter can flip the entire thing. The majority doesn't decide what's normal, the committed minority does. This isn't just a lab finding. This is the engine behind every revolution, every social movement, every cultural shift in human history, and it raises a terrifying question. If beliefs can be installed in populations like software updates, who's writing the code, that's exactly what we need to understand next. Conformity trap. In the 1950s, psychologist Solomon Asch conducted one of the most famous experiments in psychology. He showed participants a line on a card and asked them to match it with one of 3 comparison lines. The correct answer was obvious. A child could see it, but here's the twist. Everyone else in the room was an actor, and they all chose the wrong answer. What happened? Conformity. 75% of participants went along with the clearly wrong answer at least once. Not because they couldn't see the truth, because agreeing with the group felt safer than standing alone. Fear of standing alone. This is the psychological infrastructure that minorities exploit. Your brain has a conformity circuit that values social belonging over factual accuracy. When you see a group confidently stating something, a part of your brain literally recalculates what it considers true. Now, if this is making you rethink how easily your own beliefs can be shaped, hit like and subscribe to keep exploring the depths of your psyche with me. There's so much more to uncover, because Asch's experiment reveals something even darker. It's not just that people conform. It's that they stop being able to tell the difference between what they actually believe and what the group told them to believe. And that leads us to something far more dangerous. Spiral of silence. In 1974, German political scientist Elizabeth Noll-Neumann introduced a concept that explains why majorities lose. She called it the spiral of silence. People who believe their opinion is in the minority will remain silent, while those who believe they represent the majority will speak out. Here's how it works. You hold an opinion, you look around, the loudest voices seem to disagree with you, so you say nothing. But your neighbor holds the same opinion you do. They also look around, hear the same loud voices, and also say nothing. Multiply this across millions of people, and something horrifying emerges. The actual majority becomes invisible because everyone assumes they are the minority. The committed minority doesn't need to outnumber you. They just need to outvoice you. They need to create the perception that their position is dominant, and once that perception takes hold, the real majority silences itself. You've experienced this at work, in your family, online. You've watched a conversation where you knew most people disagreed with what was being said, but nobody pushed back. Everyone was waiting for someone else to speak first, and that waiting is the weapon. But this leads us to something even more disturbing about how this silence gets weaponized. Manufactured consent. Noam Chomsky and Edward Herman published a theory in 1988 that shook the foundations of media studies. They called it the manufacturing consent model. The idea is simple but devastating. Control the narrative, control reality. You don't need to control what people think directly, you just need to control what they think about, set the agenda, frame the debate, decide which questions are acceptable to ask and which are considered dangerous. The majority doesn't realize it's being managed because the boundaries of acceptable thought feel natural. They feel like common sense, but they were placed there, deliberately. The menu of choices was designed before you sat down at the table. Think about how information reaches you today. Every headline you read, every trending topic you see, every debate you're invited to participate in has been filtered, framed, and curated. Not necessarily by a shadowy conspiracy, but by systems, algorithms, and institutions that amplify certain voices and suppress others. You cannot rebel against a cage you cannot see. The committed minority that understands framing doesn't need to convince you of anything. They just need to make sure certain ideas never enter your awareness in the first place. And what comes next shows exactly how they maintain this control over time. Network power. Here's where it gets mathematical. Sociologist Mark Granovetter introduced the concept of threshold models of collective behavior. Imagine a crowd. Each person has a threshold, a number of people who need to act before they'll join in. One person has a threshold of 0. They'll act alone. They throw the first stone. Another person has a threshold of 1. They see someone acting and join. A third person needs 2 people acting before they move. A single person's courage can trigger an unstoppable cascade. This is how riots start. This is how movements begin. And this is exactly how minorities engineer mass behavior change. They don't need to convince everyone. They need to identify and activate the people with the lowest thresholds. Find the first dominoes. Once those early adopters move, they trigger the next wave, who trigger the next wave, who trigger the next wave. The majority never makes a conscious decision to change. They're pulled along by the cascade. Social network research by Nicholas Christakis shows that behaviors spread through social networks up to 3 degrees of separation. Your friend's friend's friend can change your behavior without you ever meeting them. You are being influenced by people you have never met. This network architecture is the reason a committed minority can punch so far above its weight. And speaking of networks, what happens when someone deliberately designs the network itself? Institutional capture. Political scientist Samuel Huntington observed that the most effective way to control a society is not through force. It's through institutions. The most important political distinction among countries is not their form of government, but their degree of government. A committed minority doesn't need to convince every citizen. They need to occupy the positions that shape what citizens see, learn, and believe. Education, media, legal systems, regulatory bodies, professional organizations. When a small group occupies these gatekeeping positions, they gain disproportionate influence over culture. Gatekeepers. Think about it practically. A handful of editors at major publications decide what stories get told. A small number of professors shape what an entire generation of students considers intellectual orthodoxy. A few algorithm designers determine what billions of people see in their feeds every morning. The people who set the rules don't need to win the argument because they decide what arguments are allowed. This isn't conspiracy thinking, this is structural analysis. Minorities that understand institutional leverage don't waste energy trying to persuade the masses directly. They capture the institutions that do the persuading for them. Control the gatekeepers, and you control what passes through the gate. And once these positions are secured, they create something even more powerful, a system that reinforces itself. Pluralistic ignorance. There's a phenomenon in social psychology so powerful and so invisible that most people go their entire lives without recognizing it. It's called pluralistic ignorance. Everyone privately disagrees, but publicly conforms. Here's how it works. A majority of people in a group privately reject a norm, but each individual believes that most others accept it. So they all go along with something almost nobody actually supports. The classic example comes from studies on college drinking. Researchers found that most students were uncomfortable with heavy drinking culture, but each student believed they were the exception. They believed everyone else was fine with it. So they performed enthusiasm they didn't feel, which convinced the next student that the norm was real. Everyone wearing masks, nobody realizing everyone else is wearing one too. This is perhaps the most terrifying weapon in the minority's arsenal. The majority can be held hostage by a belief system that almost nobody actually believes in. All that's required is that each individual assumes they are alone in their doubt. The committed minority simply has to maintain the illusion of consensus. They don't need to be right. They don't need to be the majority. They just need everyone to think they are. But what if I told you that your biology is working against you here too? Biology of obedience. Stanley Milgram's obedience experiments in the 1960s revealed something deeply uncomfortable about human nature. When an authority figure instructed ordinary people to deliver what they believed were painful electric shocks to another person, 65% obeyed all the way to the maximum voltage. Ordinary people, simply doing their jobs, can become agents in a terrible destructive process. But the deeper finding isn't about cruelty, it's about the neurological mechanism of obedience. When you enter what Milgram called the agentic state, you psychologically transfer responsibility to the authority figure. Your prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain responsible for independent moral reasoning, literally becomes less active. Surrender. You don't decide to be obedient. Your brain shifts into a mode where obedience becomes automatic. Your brain has an obedience switch, and it can be flipped without your permission. Now connect this to minority control. The committed minority doesn't just capture institutions and shape narratives. They position themselves as authority figures, as experts, as the voice of moral certainty. And once your brain registers them as authority, your obedience circuitry activates. Authority triggers automatic obedience. You follow not because you agree, but because your neurology makes disagreement feel dangerous. And this biological vulnerability creates the perfect conditions for what comes next. Mass psychosis. Carl Jung warned about something he considered the greatest danger facing humanity. Not war, not disease, mass psychosis. A collective mental illness that spreads through society like a contagion. Jung studied how entire civilizations could descend into irrational belief systems that, from the outside, looked like madness, but from the inside felt like absolute truth. The greatest danger to civilization is not from external enemies, but from the collective psychosis of the masses. Here's the mechanism. First, a period of confusion and anxiety destabilizes the population. People feel lost, afraid, searching for answers. Then a small group offers certainty. Simple explanations, clear enemies, a narrative that transforms confusion into conviction. 1. Create or exploit widespread anxiety. 2. Offer simple certainty to confused masses. 3. Define a clear enemy to unite against. 4. Silence dissent through social pressure. 5. Repeat until reality itself is redefined. The committed minority provides what the anxious majority desperately needs: certainty in uncertain times. And people will trade almost anything for certainty. Freedom of thought, critical reasoning, even their own direct experience, all sacrificed at the altar of belonging. And once mass psychosis takes hold, the minority doesn't need to maintain control anymore. The majority polices itself. But here's the question that matters most. Breaking free. Václav Havel, the dissident who became president of Czechoslovakia, wrote about what he called living in truth. In a society controlled by a committed minority, the most revolutionary act is not organized resistance. The most revolutionary act is simply refusing to pretend. Havel described a greengrocer who stops putting propaganda signs in his window, not because he joins a movement, but because he decides to stop living a lie. That single act of authenticity creates a crack in the system, because pluralistic ignorance depends on everyone performing compliance. When one person stops performing, it gives others permission to stop. One honest voice breaks the spell. You don't need to be louder than the minority. You don't need to organize a counter-movement. You need to be willing to say what you actually think, even when it feels like you're alone. Because remember, you're probably not alone. The research shows that most people in most situations are waiting for someone else to go first. The bravest thing you can do is speak your truth when silence feels safer. The 25% threshold works in both directions. A committed minority can install a destructive belief system, but a committed minority can also dismantle one. The only question is whether you'll be part of that 25% or part of the silent majority that lets it happen. Every mechanism we've explored today, the 25% threshold, the conformity trap, the spiral of silence, manufactured consent, network cascades, institutional capture, pluralistic ignorance, the biology of obedience, and mass psychosis, they all share one common ingredient: your silent compliance. The committed minority cannot succeed without the passive majority. Every time you stay quiet because speaking feels uncomfortable, you strengthen the very system you privately oppose. Every time you assume your opinion doesn't matter, you hand power to those who never doubt theirs. The world is a dangerous place, not because of those who do evil, but because of those who look on and do nothing. But here's the paradox that should give you hope. The same mechanisms that allow minorities to control majorities can be reversed. The same 25% threshold, the same network effects, the same cascade dynamics. All it takes is enough people deciding that their silence is too expensive. Your voice is the only currency that counts in the marketplace of ideas. If you made it this far, comment 25% if you refuse to be part of the silent majority anymore. Welcome to the Psyche Project. If this changed how you see the world around you, subscribe. Understanding power is the first step to reclaiming it.